Hello to all the world. Welcome to another Talking With. This time, Karsten Riise talking with Zlatko Hadžidedić, who is director at the Center for Nationalism Studies in Sarajevo. And Zlatko is former associate professor at the American University in the Emirates. Zlatko is a great scholar and a good friend. So I'm very happy, Zlatko, to say welcome to you here at our program.
Thank you.
And I look forward to talking with you about the whole world in the next coming about an hour. It's not perfectly 60 minutes, it's as we find appropriate. And I will now give you the only question which I have prepared for you. And that is, Zlatko, how do you see the world today and tomorrow?
Wow. Well, that's a question which requires a very long answer, I suppose, some 60 minutes or so.
Yeah.
Well, I see the world much more complicated than it used to be in the first place. I think that all the multilateral institutions that we used to know after the Second World War are actually withering away or falling apart, depends on the angle. And that actually we are entering a world in which there will be a lot of uncertainty, in which I used to call it a Hobbesian war of all against all. So I think that it is an accurate description of what we are actually encountering. And I think that there will be several powerful countries, of course, which are going to dominate such a world. But that is not going to be a repetition of the Cold War, I think. Because first of all, we don't have just two blocks. They don't have ideological differences. They all subscribe to capitalism as a system. There are different variants of capitalism they subscribe to, but after all, they all use capitalism as a tool for their own expansion and for their own domination. And after all, regardless of the fact that there will be several major powers, it will be a world in which there will be a lot of bilateral and trilateral relations. So we will have something which will be very much like, I would say, the period before the First World War. Those times we did have some kind of two blocks, but they did not have ideological differences, and those ententes of the time were actually very unstable. And it was very uncertain who is going to go to war against whom, and so on. So I think that now we are encountering that type of the world. What is particularly interesting for me as a scholar of nationalism is that we are entering the phase in which nationalism is going to be particularly important. It has been important in last 200 years, of course. I wrote a book which actually tries to explain the role of nationalism in the last 200 years, and it links it with capitalism as something, as to occurrences which cannot actually be separated. I had some ideas about the title, like No Capitalism Without Nationalism. I abandoned it, but basically that's my view, that capitalism could not survive without nationalism. That the type of exploitation and appropriation that capitalism produces on a regular basis creates a gap which eventually becomes a gap between the rich and the poor and the rest of the society. which eventually creates an unstable society. It becomes socially unsustainable. And for that purpose, capitalism had to introduce nationalism, had to introduce nations and nationalism as a way of linking the top and the bottom, and as a way of creation of illusion or delusion that such a society is actually unified, that such a society is a single one rather than divided into several classes or layers. And eventually, nationalism has not disappeared. Some people were preaching that nation states were withering away, were in disappearance, that globalism is actually the top idea of the time. But what we have witnessed in last couple of years is that we have the strengthening of nationalism and the withering away of the globalist idea. And I'm explaining that in the book, also saying that globalism was also only kind of well, a cloak of neoliberalism, that it was just a curtain behind which neoliberalism was hiding its own intentions, and that eventually neoliberalism produced some effects which necessarily had to not reintroduce nationalism, but had to introduce a stronger form of nationalism. That this gap between the rich and the poor was becoming more and more dramatic in such a way as to require introduction of a new type of nationalism, which this time would not be linked to democratic ideas as the original nationalism from the 18th and 19th centuries was, but this time that we will be getting nationalism that is necessarily linked with authoritarian system. And we have seen such trends, we have seen such things in the US with Donald Trump, we have seen such things in India with Narendra Modi, and other nationalist leaders who are actually using nationalism, but also connected with and combined with authoritarian methods. And I think that's the image of the world that we are going to face, that's the world we are going to face in the future. Apart from this idea of Hobbesian war of all against all, we will have nationalisms that are going to be based on authoritarian methods of government, and that eventually we will have a very tough world in which we will be facing permanent struggles between those power-seeking elites, which are going to create an image of national struggles, but eventually we will have the elites as we used to have them in from the very beginning with capitalism. We used to have the struggles between private elites, which were disguising this kind of struggles behind national struggles. So we will have the same pattern this time in a much harder way, much more robust way than it used to be. So I think that's the kind of world that we are going to face very soon. We are facing it actually, and I don't really see other options currently. I don't really see any kind of alternative option, because that's what we are already experiencing, and that's what is already put on the stage, and I don't really see any kind of possibility for us to avoid it.
So it seems it will be a very dynamic time, to put it mildly, which we are coming into.
Yes, definitely. I think it will be very dynamic. It will require permanent strengthening of the state structures that are going to act on behalf of these private elites, and it will require permanent struggle for power, which is not going to really produce any kind of certain outcome. I wouldn't say that. Some people say it is inevitable that China will dominate the world, that the US is going to retain the domination and so on. I don't see any kind of certain outcome, because I see is a kind of, as you said, dynamic world in which there will be uncertain outcomes of these struggles between the major powers and the major elites hidden behind their national states.
So it seems like a time coming where this, if we call it a game for power, or how you call
Yeah,
it,
struggle for
where,
power.
yeah, where this
Hobbesian war of all against all.
Hobbesian world, yeah, and where there will be a lot of ups and downs for all the involved actors. That there may be some times when one actor or one country think, wow, now we are winning, and then a short time later maybe they will see the opposite and feel that they are losing, and then the tides will change a lot of times before there will be some kind of new situation settling.
Yeah, I agree. That's how I perceive it. I don't think that there is any kind of certainty. I mean, it is certain that China is going to dominate in economic production and exports, and in the type of economy which is based on production and exports. But on the other hand, we will have the US fighting for um, the dominance that they used to have, fighting to retain their power the way they used to perceive it. I was also stating that the US cannot really live in the world in which China is going to be a kind of Cold War adversary or some kind of partner. They see the world in zero-sum categories, and they will fight for uh, to retain the position that they used to have. That's the position of number one, exclusively the number one position, and so on. And they will have many allies in that and many adversaries. It's difficult to say and predict who is going to be whose ally and adversary. What I see perhaps as the most certain in the whole image of the world is related to geography and geopolitics. I believe that there is some inevitability in unification of Eurasian continent. That China, Russia, plus Iran and Turkey, and perhaps the countries of the European Union would eventually become a single trade bloc, if not a military bloc. That the economy in the Eurasian continent will eventually become unified, and that the American continent will eventually also become self-isolated or isolated in that kind of constellation of things. So perhaps that's the ultimate outcome that I can see due to this kind of geographic um, conditions that are determining the final outcome. But in the meantime, perhaps during at least 50 years, we will have this kind of world in which there will be permanent struggles for power before we actually get this kind of pacification, if you like, in terms of
or stabilization.
Yeah, or stabilization in terms of geopolitical unification of geographic units.
That would, so coming to your and discussing this transition period, which you see will, in your view, be very long. You use the image of pre-1914. So that sort of says to me, a lot of people are now discussing in the context of a new Cold War, could there be two blocks again? United States would like they would like themselves to be leading one bloc against China and Russia. But you see this as a much more complicated image, a much more complicated picture imaging, as I understand you.
Well, at this particular moment, we do have the US against Russia and China. That's certainly true. But on the other hand, what I see there is, as I said, they all rely on a single ideology. First of all, they all rely on a single economic system, and they do not have different ideologies that they would subscribe to or that they would use as their way of domination of the world. So it is possible, and I see this image of the pre-World War One world as more likely, because simply there will be changes. It is no Cold War with two ideological blocks, which cannot possibly change their views or their positions until completely defeated, as it actually happened in 1989. Here we have Russia that can be detached from China, and the US will be trying to press Russia to the extent of detaching itself from China in the first place. Now it looks as if the US is obsessed with Russia, fighting Russia by all means, and so on. But eventually, I'm convinced that the US is trying to press Russia in such a way to detach it from the alliance with China and make it its own ally. So that is also a possibility. I don't think it would be smart on Russia's part to follow that uh, idea, but on the other hand, it is possible. On the other hand, there are West European countries, it is very questionable whether they are going to remain allied with the US unconditionally, or they are going to start to follow their economic interests and to trade with China and Russia increasingly, and to eventually create some kind of uh, trade constellation that might look like a trade bloc with Russia and China. All these things are really questionable. I don't think there is any degree of certainty. Then there is another uncertainty in the whole thing. There are some people who believe that they can launch a world war, not just minor bilateral wars or some proxy wars and so on. There are people, primarily in the US foreign policy elite, who believe that they can win a nuclear war with a preemptive attack. And I think that we should not dismiss such a possibility, because those people are already in power. they do have influence, and then they can sell their ideas to the administration, to the current administration or the next administration, and so on. So it's very likely for them to be successful in such attempts, because they already have positions that provide them such opportunities. So perhaps there are such people in Russia too. Perhaps there are such people in China as well. The only ones that we certainly know of are those in the US, but there are certainly people who believe in the possibility of winning a nuclear war. During the Cold War, such an opportunity was totally dismissed. You know, there was a nuclear tension between the two powers, but as we know it, even from the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was no real possibility of launching a nuclear war. Both sides were very skeptical about the possibility of winning the war, and they were not ready to actually start it. Now, as we are entering a much more uncertain world, now I think there are more people who believe that they can also win such a war, and probably two locations where there is more likelihood to launch such a war, to trigger such a war, are Ukraine with Russia, of course, between the US and Russia, or Taiwan between US and China. We can notice that there are already people who claim that China is preparing to attack Taiwan, and that they should be prepared to counter China, and they should be prepared for war against China. As far as we know, China is not really preparing to occupy Taiwan or to attack Taiwan. They have a totally different foreign policy, which is based on Confucian wisdom of going step by step. So I don't think that there is any likelihood for China to actually launch a war, an aggression against Taiwan. But nevertheless, you will find many people in the US foreign policy establishment who are claiming that China is already preparing, and that they should be prepared for that and prepared for an all-out war against China. So I think that the world we are entering is really uncertain, and that there are people who actually do not have any kind of stable views of the world and of the world's future, that they believe that they can simply change some unfavorable trends the way they want to, by launching wars, by pressing more than they used to, and so on. I mean, more than their states used to press other states, and so on. So it is going to be quite uncertain. I think that there are many elements which are introducing a lot of uncertainty. So to summarize, we have this kind of lack of multilateral institutions and the increase of bilateral tensions and conflicts, Hobbesian world, a war of all against all. Then we have nationalism that is going to be relying on authoritarian methods of governing. And then we also have this kind of nuclear uncertainty that is going to arise very soon, in my opinion. So these three things, when you put them together, they are bringing a total uncertainty into what we are going to face.
There may be, I believe there will be conflict running short of war, I do believe that a lot of people also in the United States will not want to trade a nuclear war for Taiwan or for Ukraine. But that leaves a lot of other options open. And I think all of these options will be, including, of course, studying the nuclear option. But I feel quite sure that all these options and all these possible arenas for conflict will be tried out. And I see more arenas even than you mentioned. We have the economic arena. Would it be possible to strangle some other countries in order to gain power? We see the technological arena, which is actually a well-tried concept. Would it be possible to, for example, for the USA to starve out China in technology? I have looked at that and come to the conclusion that will not be possible, but it may still be something which they can try for 5 or 10 years if they want to.
I agree. Those would be the first steps, you know. I was talking about ultimate steps.
Okay.
I mean, the economic pressure comes first, and technological advancement is something which clearly brings advantage to some of these competitors. It is just that, you know, those are the first steps. I just wanted to explain what kind of consequences they will produce in perhaps in geopolitical sense and so on. But certainly these two spheres are going to be dominant in the first place.
So you see a hardening.
They're going to be everyday events, so to speak.
Okay, so you see this is you see now a future where all these kind of tensions will be stepped up, and when tensions at one level are, so to speak, exhausted, tensions in another level will be tried out.
Yes, something like that. I think that's a good definition.
Yeah. What I find interesting here are some of the parallels between what you say and what I have talked with other people like you in this program talking with. I had the other program with Andrei Kortunov, who is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council in Moscow. And he described the coming future as a death zone, which is very much what you actually also described. You don't use that word, but it is like a kind of death zone, what you describe, Zlatko. So I do see some similarities or parallels here. It's similar views. And also, Andrei from Moscow saw what you discussed about globalization, that somehow there will now come a movement in the opposite direction of globalization. And Andrei, he talked even of deglobalization.
Well, there has never been a real globalization, you know. If you want to hear my complete opinion on that, I think that globalization happened in the 17th century with the introduction of capitalism. From the day one, capitalism was a globalist system and a globalist ideology. What we had under the name of globalism or globalization was actually the spread of neoliberal ideology and neoliberal economy. And as I said, neoliberalism has produced some kind of gap, which was much more dramatic, the gap between the rich and the rest of society than it used to be in the 18th and 19th centuries, when nationalism was introduced as a kind of savior for capitalism. This time, neoliberalism has produced much more dramatic gap between the top and the bottom, so that neoliberalism had to be followed by a more dramatic form of nationalism, which means nationalism under authoritarian regime or using authoritarian regime instead of a democratic one. Because traditional nationalism was always related to democratic ideas. The nation as such is actually the translation of the Greek demos. But this time we are going to have a kind of nationalism that we have already seen with Donald Trump. I think he's a perfect mannequin of the future world. Of what
But
we
that
are.
that is perhaps a relative movement, because when we go to your description of coming now to a world like pre-1914, I mean, when I was reading also about the early capitalism, and people were starving at that time. They were dying of hunger also in England around the year 1800.
That's a marker of capitalism.
Pardon?
That's a marker of capitalism.
That people starve.
Yes.
That was actually some of the ideologies of capitalism at that time were extremely tough. I mean, they wanted starvation to move people
Yes.
to work in the factories. They were very conscious about that.
Yes.
Very conscious about that.
Yeah, I mean, what we know as capitalism, our problem of our generation's problem is that we know capitalism in a different form. We know capitalism which was based on Keynesian methods and the idea of welfare state. Capitalism at the time after the Second World War did change precisely in order to compete with communism. There had to be an idea and a movement towards equality in the capitalist world so as to be able to compete with the communist idea of absolute equality. Eventually, after the defeat of communism, capitalism has gone back to what it had used to be.
But it's interesting because this development, which you
In the 30s, people were of the 20th century, people were also starving.
that's
Not
right.
only in the 19th century.
But
And
if we go back to the time of Bismarck in Germany, which was an authoritarian state and capitalist state, the first kind of welfare state was not made by social democrats or socialists. It was actually made by Bismarck, who was arch-conservative and who had seen the revolutions in the year
he
of...
was a follower of Friedrich List,
Yeah,
a famous German economist who is a kind of marginal figure in the current global economy. He was the one who introduced the doctrine of strengthening of nations in economic terms. And
that's
Bismarck
true.
was a follower of his ideas. But what we live in is an Anglo-Saxon type of capitalism, call it Adam Smith's or David Ricardo's type of capitalism.
Yeah.
And we don't have Friedrich List anymore. Or perhaps China's system is the closest to what we can imagine as closest to List's ideas of how to strengthen the entire society rather than only a small elite. So the Anglo-Saxon type of capitalism, Adam Smith's type of capitalism, I mean, it's ridiculous that the title of the book is The Wealth of Nations, but the whole book is how to enrich the individuals who are skillful enough to become rich. So it's not the wealth of nations. Friedrich List's theory is actually about the wealth of nations. Adam Smith's theory is about the wealth of individuals.
It's interesting that you connect China today.
Which we are living now. That's my explanation of Bismarck's,
Yeah. But there are parallels, and I find it interesting what you point to here. There are parallels because Bismarck's introduction of social welfare, it was unemployment benefits, and it was healthcare benefits and so on for German workers, was inspired by the revolutions in 1848, and people in Germany, also conservative people, said, well, we have to make a new kind of, you have the word social contract, we have to have a new kind of social contract in order to avoid this socialist of people. And now you mentioned China in this context, and it's very interesting because I was reading a very important Korean economist who is called Ha-Joon Chang. And Ha-Joon Chang from South Korea explicitly mentions Friedrich List as one who has inspired and should inspire Korea and other countries. And it's also interesting because what Ha-Joon Chang mentions about the USA is he has a book which is called Kicking Away the Ladder. And it's about the United States. Once they have themselves climbed up the ladder of development, they kick away the ladder so that nobody else can follow them up. That's the idea of his. So what Ha-Joon Chang describes in one of his books are very, very interesting. I recommend them. Of course, when you read things like this, there will be some things where you disagree a little and some things where you perhaps disagree a little more. But Ha-Joon Chang, I think, is a very good author in these things, and he writes a lot of things which makes big sense, which really is interesting. And what Ha-Joon Chang describes is how the United States in the 19th century, when they were industrializing the United States, actually were learning from Friedrich List. They were using this not in a social welfare state. They were far from that, totally far. They had the Anglo-Saxon. But
I'm not so surprised by that.
Yeah,
because
but
the US is not really the place where this type of Anglo-Saxon capitalism was born. It was England.
Yeah.
And the US was a different state prior to the 20th century. Very different.
Yeah.
It did have List's ideas, I'm pretty sure. Although there was a kind of ruling oligarchy which also adopted the Anglo-Saxon type of thinking and so on. But actually, prior to the First World War, when the US was drawn into the British bloc, I would say that the US was a totally different state. They had their Monroe Doctrine, we should remember that.
Yeah.
Meaning that they were oriented towards resources in Latin America, that they did not play a global policeman, never thought of it actually, never thought of being drawn into any kind of European conflict.
Yeah.
That's the EU. But once they were drawn into the British network of interests, they have become a different state. Now we are using the US as an image of that type of thinking, but as a symbol of that type of thinking. But actually, it has always been Britain, which has used the US to a great extent due to their cultural affinity and closeness and so on, and influence they had upon the US elite. So eventually they have drawn the US into their network of interests, and the US has become the front runner of that type of capitalism. Although I'm pretty sure that in the 19th century, the US was a quite different state.
Yeah, and this is what Ha-Joon Chang describes, and he describes it for one phenomenon both for the United States and and for Britain. Britain and the United States were both very protectionist. until their own industry was strong enough to compete. Only at that time did they demand that everybody open up their borders for their products.
Sure, of course. What else?
Yeah.
Did we expect them to be principled or to be cynical? I mean,
the latter. What is utilitarian is to...
Yeah, it's quite normal that once you become strong enough that you require others to obey your rules.
Yeah. So this is the truth about the so-called rules-based world order. It's the world order of the rules created by the strongest.
Yeah, sure. It's always created by the strongest, and it's always a matter of domination. It's never a matter of principles.
When I was talking with Amitav Acharya in the previous episode of this television program, Talking With, Amitav is a distinguished professor at the American University in Washington, and he's born in India and has also been working in a lot of places in Asia and Europe. And Amitav mentioned also this, which is I would like to draw in here because it actually echoes very much of what you say, in the way that Amitav mentioned that nobody in the United States elite can still ever imagine the United States to be number 2 in the world. They simply cannot imagine it.
Yes, that's the main problem. It's
yeah, and it goes for all of them. It doesn't matter if they are Republican or Democrat and so on. It's a whole. They call it the blob. The whole foreign policy establishment, military, civil. It's the same establishment. They simply cannot imagine the United States being number 2.
Yes. Exactly.
And every book,
some logic that I was talking about.
Exactly. This is why I mention it, because it simply taps into precisely what you say, that they will fight with everything they've got to try to preserve their number 1 position.
Yeah, I mean, it's better for the world not to exist than to exist without the US on top.
Yeah, that would be a very harsh word to say, way to say it. But Amitav also mentioned how many, and I can only subscribe to his observation. Every time there is somebody writing a book or an article or op-ed or analysis in the United States about the competition between United States and China, it always ends with this, that they always still have the chance to become number 1 and stay number 1.
Yeah, it's always like that. It's inconceivable to be a number.
And that is what I find, and I think sadly you say actually the same. That is what is very dangerous today.
Yeah, sure, it is dangerous. First of all, it is dangerous in politics to have any kind of inconceivable ideas.
Oh yeah.
Politics is about
art of the possible.
Of the possible.
Yeah.
So if you find anything impossible to imagine, then it's going to be bad politics, or it's going to be something which goes counter the very logic of politics. That's the basic problem.
But that seems to be, and this is something we have discussed today, earlier also. To me, the interesting thing about Trump was that in a way, Trump didn't care about the rest of the world. I mean, he said America first, but in a way, he was only thinking about America. But now with Biden, we are back into this very active project of trying to keep America on top of the world, a project which is doomed to fail.
Well, it's difficult to say if it is doomed to fail, although I tend to agree with you. It is still that there is a possibility, as I said, to launch a series of wars or even a nuclear war to prevent it. The problem with Biden is that he perceives the world in Cold War terms.
Yeah.
Still. And the world has become much more complicated. Now it's no longer only Russia, now you have China. It's very difficult to say who is really stronger in economic terms, who is really stronger in military terms, and so on. So I think that it's very dangerous to apply past categories to the present. That's one of the things. And as for Trump, I think that Trump's idea was actually to reshuffle the world and to create a kind of a pause for some time until the US gets strong enough to dominate again the way they used to, or the way they imagine it. They literally withdrew from the world for 4 years on that.
Yeah.
When he was coming to power, I said, thanks God. I mean, I was one of the few, because I was quite certain that Hillary Clinton was a war option, or the war option.
I agree. I saw it the same way.
And I was really afraid of her launching a war against Russia, using Ukraine as a trigger, and so on, launching a real nuclear war. And I was pretty sure that Trump would do the opposite and try to reconstitute the US domination by withdrawing first and trying to reconstitute the US as a state. But that includes the strengthening of a different type of nationalism that I was already referring to. Now what we have in the US, now they have practically two nations within one. They are no longer a single nation. You have a traditional American society, a traditional American nation, a multi-ethnic, multi-religious nation, and on the other hand, you have Trump's followers who are just white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who believe that they are the ones who are appointed to be the American nation. And now they are split. But Trump's ideas were probably to reconstitute the American society in such a way as to create an Anglo-Saxon and white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation as the American nation, which would then be much stronger and readier to enter any type of conflicts. But he needed some time to reconstitute the American society first. So I don't think that he failed in anything, actually. I mean, he was just premature. But those things that he launched and he started, it's something which is probably going to happen in the US.
I agree. I
cannot imagine the US going back to the idea of a multi-ethnic society, despite the fact that they have more different ethnic groups, more different races and religious groups, and so on. The idea which Trump introduced into American society, I mean, he was not the first one to introduce it, but it has become widespread with Trump, of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation as a single one, is something which is eventually going to be the winner. I think that it's only premature.
I believe that I have looked at the figures of Christianity and race in the United States, and white people in the United States are losing their religion at an incredible pace. So it will not be so many years before less than half of all white people in the United States will no longer be Christian, and that is a revolution in itself. And we have the second.
Allow that to win.
Pardon?
But some people will not allow that to be a winner.
Yeah, but it's difficult to force a religion onto people, onto other people once they have lost it. And the other,
a matter of folklore, you know. Religion is a matter of rituals and procedure. It's not about faith. Faith is different. But religion serves the purpose of mobilizing people.
Yeah.
Religion is.
I agree that faith is different, but sometimes they can be overlapping these two. But another thing is the amount of white people that in the year 2000 and around 2045, which is sometime in the future, but not incredibly far away in the future, around 2045, thereabout, the majority of people in the United States will not be white. From that time on, the white people. But I agree with you in the
white
sense
people will become increasingly and incredibly militant.
This is a possibility, at least until that point. What I would like to connect with you on is that you mentioned that the United States is very fractured, like in two states, which are in war with each other. And this is also my observation. It's a very tragic thing to see, but they are really at war with each other. And it's much worse than when they had the civil war, because at that time they were geographically divided, that they had some in north and some in south, which were against each other. But now it's in every state, every part of the United States is divided.
Yeah, this is the real civil war. I would agree with that. That is a
very, very problematic and potentially dangerous situation. And then we have the issue which you come back to, and is an issue of interest which connect you and me, this discussion about nationalism, that in a way we have two kinds of American nationalism which are competing, which are fighting against each other.
Sure. Nationalism is always competing with another nationalism.
Yeah, but here inside the same state, it's not. Yeah. And that is interesting. It is not. Trump has a nationalism, which it is obvious, but Biden and the Democrats have exactly as strong and close-minded nationalism as well. It's just a bit different.
I think that Biden's view of the world, I mentioned already his backward thinking perception of the world, but there is something which Biden's administration and the Democrats need to do in order to unify the country again. They need to pursue a very militant and very aggressive foreign policy, which may...
That's what they do.
Yeah, in order to unify the country. Otherwise, they cannot unify the country. They have to invent external enemies in order to create any type of social unity within. And perhaps even to launch a war, perhaps even to do things which may seem inconceivable at the moment, but they need some kind of external enemy, external pressure, be that invented or real, but they need it in order to unify the American society and recreate the American nation. And that's what they are doing. I mean, I understand them from the methodological point of view. I mean, I would do the same, I suppose, if I were...
I don't think so, but you're a different kind of person.
But, or, I mean, I was a political advisor, so that's probably what I would have advised a politician.
Well, I hope not, but that's a different point. Yeah.
But that's a method. That's a common method, and I understand them from that point of view. But on the other hand, it's increasingly dangerous because the world is becoming more complicated. It's not as simple as that. There are many possible or potential enemies, but there are also many potential allies among those that you mark as potential enemies.
That's
So
true.
the world is really complicated. It's not really about I will proclaim you my enemy and I will unite my own society by that. It's not like that, although methodologically they are doing the correct thing, but at the end of the world, they may well produce a global conflict by that.
And they may lose it.
And even a nuclear disaster.
There is a problem also here because it's like a kind of axis of evil approach which Biden is running now against Russia and China. Bush had Bush number two had the same approach with Iraq and Iran and North Korea. He called them the axis of evil. And in my analysis,
axis of evil.
Pardon?
It is just a bigger axis.
Exactly. Now the old axis of evil was not big enough anymore, so there has to be a bigger one to unite the people behind the Democrat Party. And here we have when we look into, I think it's interesting. The more I study American ideas and history, also, I mean, in all countries, when you go back in history, you see that there are different phases and there are different ideas, and some of these ideas have since been forgotten, but they are still there in the history. And the United States have a conservative idea, which is Quincy Adams, who said that the United States, she should not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy. And that is a tradition which is in the conservative tradition, where
I would say.
Pardon?
I would say it used to be.
There. Yeah, it used to be. When I say it is, I mean
I don't see it alive anymore.
I see it actually because I look at different media outlets. So what I see is that it is still there, but it is not yet dominant. It is latent.
It's not the Republicans, that's for sure.
Also in the, actually exactly in the Republicans, not in the Democrats. I see it in the Republican Party, but not in the dominant part. Yeah. I see it in some niche.
There is some alternative part that is not so visible at the moment.
I mean, conservatism you have is like also other movements, is also a popular movement, and there are intellectuals who are not in the party circles, in the inner party circles, who are openly discussing these things and advocating them, but they are not yet really influential. But what I see is that this discussion is going on in the United States, and that discussion might come into the inner circle of decision one day. I cannot say that it will, and I cannot say when it will. I just say it is there. It is not what you hear in the big media, because it's not really up in the big media, but it is still there in the United States, and this is something we could hope for could somehow come into play in the United States.
I hope that these structures will, and these ideas will survive. I'm just a bit skeptical, because once you have the Republican Party having been seized by people like Trump and his supporters, it's very difficult to revive. I think that Liz Cheney was actually the last attempt of traditional Republican Party, although her father was far from being a traditional.
Oh yeah.
He was one of those who introduced Trump into power, if you like. But at the end of the day, it's very difficult for any kind of alternative structure to get back into the party which has already been seized by certain people who already have their ideas about how to run the country and run the world. So I'm just skeptical from purely, utilitarian point of view. I don't think it is very likely, but it is good that they do exist as an alternative. Perhaps this option will eventually prove wrong, and perhaps some people who have been supporting it will give it up and reorient towards the traditional values. But right now we have the problem that these traditional values, which used to be American, are very far away from the top.
Oh, but we also have had a long period of neoconservatism as a liberal
I
Cold
think that
War
was,
ideology.
I think that was a fake name. It was called neoconservatism, but had nothing to do with conservatism. It was neoliberalism, provided that we agree on a definition of liberalism. Liberalism is a free market ideology, and it's an ideology that is made to enrich the most capable in the free market. And that's what we used to have. I don't know for what reason the term neoconservative was being used. I think it's deeply wrong, because they were far from conservatism. They were just, neoliberals spreading liberal ideas. It is just that some people who were on the left, I suppose, did not like the idea of linking them to the word liberal, so they proclaimed them. But liberalism has never been a leftist nor progressive, if you like, ideology. It has always been an ideology of an oligarchy.
But I
And that's what neoliberalism was in a more drastic way.
yeah, I agree that the name neoconservatism, it's always difficult what's in a name. Some of those people who originated these ideas were actually, believe it or not, former American communists. So that's a history actually, and some of them had been, and you can imagine, I mean, communism in America was really a fringe movement. It did exist, but there were very few of them. But some of them did exist, and they changed their own ideas against communism, but they were still revolutionaries. So neoconservatism is a kind of revolutionary ideology, where the United States should kind of make a revolution on the rest of the world now in name of liberal ideas. And now I use the name liberal ideas as what you say, in the name of freedom, in the name of capitalism and all this. It was a revolutionary idea which found place in both parties, Republican and Democrat.
Yeah, certainly it was present in both parties. There was a consensus on neoliberal ideology in both parties. And not only in the US, in Britain, in Europe, and so on. I would say that probably the only country where liberal ideas were rather weak and did not really prevail is Germany. Uh, Perhaps countries like Sweden or Denmark, Finland, Norway, and so on, but they are on the fringe, as as you use the term. But of the major powers, I would say that Germany was the only country where neoliberal ideas did not prevail at the time and have not prevailed.
Mm.
I was always telling people from Germany, come on, you don't know what capitalism is. You live in socialist country. Yeah. And when I was speaking with Norwegians, when they were trying to explain me their system, I would say, well, that's exactly what Marx wanted. You know, that people work as much as they can and that they get payments as much as they are supposed to, and so on. So I would say that what we know as capitalism is a kind of Anglo-Saxon type of capitalism, but unfortunately it has spread around the world. It has become dominant. There are very few countries
The
which
Scandinavian countries, they made their own kind of communism, and it's still a kind of totalitarian. It's a more not overt, not so obvious totalitarian system, but it's very totalitarian, but it's different from what you described. What I find interesting here is also when you coming back to your description of the pre-1914 is the position of Europe and the position of East Asia. Because the United States used to have Europe in the NATO as a bastion against communism, against the Soviet Union at that time. And in the Pacific, the United States had Japan, Korea, and the East Asian states as a bulwark, as their area of operation against communism in China.
Yes.
And what I see now is that Biden is not reflecting, not thinking about what the world is today, but somehow trying to replay the world that he knew before 1989, the old Cold War. So Biden is trying to reconnect, to re-establish this kind of world order where Europe in Western Europe is the bulwark on behalf of the United States against Russia, and where Biden wants to make East Asia as a American bulwark against China. And my analysis is this will not work for one simple reason. Not this time. It worked in the Cold War, but it will not work in a new Cold War.
Yeah,
because they all earn money on China.
Well, that's a simple truth.
Yeah,
I agree with that.
and I mean, this is something
they cannot live without trading with China.
Exactly. I mean, Germany has bigger exports to China than they have exports to the United States. So if they have to choose, they don't want to choose. They want to continue making money with everybody. But if the Germans should choose where to make money, they will say, okay, the biggest customer for us is China.
Yeah, that's why I forecasted the eventual unification of the Eurasian continent. I think that's a natural development of things.
I agree.
But on the other hand, we have the Anglo-Saxon doctrine, which was actually invented by Halford Mackinder in 1904 in his famous The Geographical Pivot of History, that whoever dominates the world islands, meaning Eurasia, dominates the world. Therefore, the Anglo-Saxon powers should prevent any kind of unification and always create zones of instability between. He thought that Russia and Germany were the most likely powers that would dominate the Eurasian continent. So the idea was to create zones of instability between Russia and Germany. Now it's about creating such spheres between Russia and China. We know the stories about the clash of civilizations or Brzezinski's grand chessboard. It was about destabilization of Central Asia, actually, triggering a war between Islamic countries of the former Soviet Union and Russia in order to separate China from Russia and China from the rest of Eurasia. So those are just variations on Mackinder's theory. And the Anglo-Saxon powers, they can apply it for some time, but there is geographical logic that eventually prevails. Yeah. I think that the Chinese reversed the whole doctrine by their Belt and Road Initiative, instead of the domination of Anglo-Saxon powers in maritime trade, they are trying to replace that with the continental trade by developing their own infrastructure. And that's a typical reversal of Mackinder's ideas. And I think that eventually that option needs to prevail because it is simply based, as Mackinder himself would probably admit, it is based on geographical logic.
Yeah, yeah. And it is, as Mackinder also based it, and maybe this is a good point for us to round off the discussion. But the reason why Mackinder came up with this theory was the development of rail transport, of railways. Because the Eurasian, I agree with you in your analysis. I just think this is an interesting point, coming a full turn 360 degrees in history, because the precondition for Eurasia as the heartland, as a dominant continent in the world, was that it could be connected inside with infrastructure, with railways.
Railways.
Yeah.
And for a long time, there was no possibility of building a different type of railways. But now there is technology for a different type of railways, speed railways, and simply there is
Cargo.
a possibility. Yeah, there is another possibility to replace maritime trade by
Exactly. And this is what China is doing very successfully.
Yes, they do it, and they simply know what they are doing, and I'm impressed by the fact that they have really done all the steps that were necessary to reverse the picture of the world that was created by Mackinder's theory and by Great Britain and the US following Mackinder's ideas. They have managed to reverse the entire image of the world just by multiplying the whole theory by -1.
And then we should add perhaps that they have built a navy too, which is bigger than the US Navy.
Yeah, and that too, yes.
Just as a little extra thing to mention.
Yeah.
I don't know. We have no fixed time limit, but we have spent a little more than an hour here. Is there anything you would like to go into or mention, or anything you would like to ask me about, Zlatko?
Well, not really. I mean, we have exhausted so many topics that it should probably be beyond my capabilities at the present moment to do anything else. Perhaps if I were to take some rest, then I might remember something. But at the moment, I think that we have really exhausted all the relevant topics of the current world and the future world as we understand them. Perhaps we are not the ultimate measure of the things, but as far as the two of us understand them, I think that we have exhausted them.
That's great. I will say, Zlatko, thank you very much for your time and for your good ideas and for your friendship. It is always exciting to talk with you, because somehow we always come to some new ideas, and there are always this interesting, I think, that there are things we see the same way, and there are also a few things which we see differently, and that is always what is needed for good discussion.
Yeah, sure.
So with these words, I will say thank you very much to you, Zlatko, and I will say thank you to all the audience that we have all around the world. Thank you for watching this episode of Talking With, and see you next time.